Each year, military historians and paranormal researchers alike document hundreds of battlefield encounters that resist every rational explanation offered by conventional science. Incidents buried so deeply within classified archives that entire careers have been dedicated to ensuring they never reach public consciousness. It occurs with such alarming frequency that the United States Department of Defense maintained no fewer than 3 separate classified programs throughout the 20th century, specifically tasked with investigating what internal memos euphemistically called non-standard combat phenomena, with combined operational budgets exceeding $400 million across 3 decades of active research. The Pacific theater of World War II remains, to this day, the single most densely documented region for these encounters. A vast ocean graveyard where over 2 million men died across thousands of islands, many of which had been considered sacred ground by indigenous populations for centuries, before the first shot of the war was ever fired. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought between October and December of 1944, was the largest naval engagement in recorded human history, involving over 200,000 Allied personnel and resulting in more than 15,000 American casualties across the Philippine archipelago. Numbers so staggering that individual unit reports were routinely lost, suppressed, or simply never filed at all. For a brief and deeply disturbing period during the ground campaign on Leyte Island in November of 1944, one reinforced rifle company of the United States Marine Corps would stumble upon something inside a captured Japanese stronghold that no military protocol, no chain of command, and no officer's training had ever prepared any of them to face. But what exactly were the figures standing motionless inside that base? Upright, uniformed, apparently operational, despite having been clinically dead for no less than 3 weeks? And why did the Marine Corps subsequently erase every record of the 9th Rifle Company, 1st Battalion, from the official history of the Leyte campaign as thoroughly as if those men had never set foot on Philippine soil? Leyte is the 8th largest island in the Philippine archipelago, covering approximately 7,214 square kilometers of terrain so geographically hostile that military planners at MacArthur's headquarters in Hollandia privately referred to it as the island that eats armies. Its interior is dominated by a central mountain range that rises sharply from coastal plains, perpetually saturated by some of the heaviest rainfall on Earth. Annual precipitation exceeding 2,500 millimeters, concentrated into storms that turned jungle trails into rivers overnight and reduced visibility to less than 10 meters in the dense secondary growth that covered nearly 70% of the island's landmass. The combination of volcanic soil, oppressive humidity averaging 91% year-round, and a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrated to ground level created an environment with a boundary between the living and the dead seemed, to every man who fought there, genuinely and disturbingly thin. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that Leyte had been considered one of the most spiritually charged territories in all of Southeast Asia for well over 1,000 years before American boots ever touched its shores. The indigenous Visayan people of Leyte had maintained an unbroken animist tradition stretching back to at least the 9th century, centered on the veneration of spirits they called Anito, ancestral entities that did not merely inhabit the afterlife, but actively occupied specific physical locations in the living world, bound to particular groves, rock formations, river confluences, and elevated clearings that the community recognized as permanently and irrevocably theirs. Spanish colonial records from 1595, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, describe Visayan priests called Babaylan performing elaborate appeasement rituals at a site near the western foothills of the Central Range, a clearing the locals identified only as ang lugar and G. Amganamate na Hindi Umalis, which translates with uncomfortable directness as the place where the dead did not leave. The same documents note with evident unease that Spanish missionaries who attempted to erect a cross at this location in 1597 were found the following morning arranged in a precise semicircle at the clearing's edge, upright, facing inward, their eyes open, and that the garrison physician who examined them could determine no cause of death and no explanation for how men who had been dead for what he estimated was several hours were still standing unsupported when discovered. The Babaylan elders who were consulted refused to approach the site and would say only that the Anito, they were Hindi Mapapoing Takot, impossible to frighten away. American military intelligence had, in fact, encountered fragmented warnings about this specific region of Leyte's western interior well before the October landings. A classified report filed in August of 1944 by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Drummond of the Office of Strategic Services, based on interviews with Filipino resistance fighters operating under the USAFFE guerrilla network, documented recurring accounts of Japanese soldiers abandoning their posts in the foothills sector without orders, without equipment, and without any subsequent contact with their own command structure. Filipino scouts interviewed for the same report described finding Japanese patrols in the western jungle in conditions that contradicted every known timeline, men whose decomposition was visibly advanced, but who had apparently continued performing routine patrol movements for days after any biological possibility of doing so had long passed. The OSS report was stamped restricted and filed under the deliberately vague category of indigenous psychological warfare tactics, a classification that ensured it would be read by almost no one in MacArthur's operational planning staff, and that the men of the 9th Rifle Company would advance toward the western foothills in November of 1944 with absolutely no warning of what had already happened to every other armed force that had disturbed that ground. On November 14, 1944, at approximately 1840 hours local time, Sergeant First Class Theodore Teddy Warnock of Youngstown, Ohio, led his 8-man forward scout element through the last navigable tree line before the western foothills clearing, moving on coordinates extracted from a captured Japanese supply manifest that indicated an active enemy communications post at grid reference XT7741. Warnock was 26 years old, a 3-year veteran of the Pacific Campaign who had fought at Guadalcanal and Peleliu, a man his platoon commander, First Lieutenant Douglas Farrell, privately described in correspondence as the most unshakable human being I have ever encountered in or out of combat, a reputation Warnock had earned by remaining functionally calm through situations that had broken younger and less experienced men completely. Moving alongside Warnock were Corporal Augusto Gus Reinhold, a first-generation German-American from Milwaukee, whose mechanical aptitude made him the squad's designated radio operator. Private First Class Samuel Okafor, a powerfully built 22-year-old from Baltimore, who carried the squad's bar like it weighed nothing. And Private Leon Shemansky of Detroit, the youngest member of the element at 19, on only his second week of active ground operations in the Philippine theater. The temperature at ground level was 31 degrees Celsius, with humidity so complete that the men's utilities had been soaked through since before noon, and the jungle around them produced the particular dense, layered noise of a Philippine evening. Insects, distant water, the occasional crack of something large moving through undergrowth that every experienced Pacific veteran learned to read like a language, listening always for the specific quality of silence that meant something was wrong. Warnock noticed that silence at 1847 hours, 7 minutes into their approach. Not the silence of an enemy ambush, which every man in the element would have recognized and responded to automatically, but something different, something that Warnock would later describe in the single deposition he was permitted to give before his transfer orders arrived, as the sound of the jungle deciding it wanted nothing to do with what was ahead of us. Every insect, every bird, every rustle of canopy movement, gone simultaneously as if a switch had been thrown. Reinhold noticed it too, and instinctively reached for his radio handset before realizing the equipment had gone completely dead in his hands. Not the intermittent static failure common in tropical humidity, but a total, absolute silence from the receiver that his technical experience told him was physically impossible given that he had tested the unit less than 40 minutes prior, and every component had been fully operational. The stronghold emerged from the tree line at 1853 hours, and every man in Warnock's element stopped moving at exactly the same moment without any order being given, because what they were looking at required several seconds of processing before the conscious mind could begin assembling it into something coherent. The structure was a reinforced Japanese field bunker of the type standard to Imperial Army defensive positions throughout the Pacific timber and packed earth construction, approximately 18 meters across, with firing slits cut at regular intervals and a single entrance covered by a canvas flap weighted at the bottom. It was, by every external indicator, an active and occupied enemy position. Lights were burning inside, the warm yellowish glow of kerosene lanterns visible through the firing slits, casting moving shadows that suggested occupants in motion. A field radio mounted on a wooden bracket outside the eastern wall was transmitting an active signal. The Imperial Japanese Army's standard 94 to 6 shortwave unit cycling through what Reinhold would later identify as a legitimate operational frequency, broadcasting a repeating sequence that sounded like routine position confirmation. From somewhere inside the structure came the smell of cooked rice and fish broth, a meal recently prepared, still hot, the steam visible in the cooler air near the entrance flap. And from a bamboo pole planted at the bunker's northeast corner, an Imperial Japanese flag hung perfectly motionless in air that, everywhere else in the clearing, moved with a faint, warm breeze. Warnock signaled his element into assault formation, and they approached with the controlled, professional discipline of men who had done this before. And it was Okafor, moving closest to the entrance, who first registered that something about the shadows moving across the firing slits was not consistent with normal human movement. They were too regular, too identical, repeating at precise intervals, like the second hand of a clock, rather than the variable, organic movement of living bodies. Warnock made entry at 1901 hours, Okafor and Reinhold flanking him, Szymanski and the remaining 4 men covering the exterior perimeter, and the 3 men who went through that canvas flap together stopped breathing at the same instant and remained unable to speak, for what Reinhold would later estimate as approximately 8 seconds, an eternity in a combat entry situation, a duration that under normal circumstances would have gotten all 3 of them killed. There were 11 Japanese soldiers inside the bunker. They were standing at their posts with the precise, formal bearing of men on active duty. 2 at the radio equipment, 3 at the firing slits on the western wall, 2 seated at a field table with maps spread open before them, 4 positioned at intervals along the eastern wall as if awaiting orders. Every one of them was in full Imperial Army uniform, weapons present, equipment in order. Every one of them had been dead for weeks. The decomposition was not subtle, and it was not ambiguous. In the 31-degree heat of a Philippine November, 3 weeks of biological breakdown had produced changes that were visible, unmistakable, and in the enclosed space of the bunker, overwhelmingly present as a physical smell, the specific, penetrating sweetness of advanced putrefaction that every combat veteran in the Pacific knew from the aftermath of a firefight, the smell that clung to clothing and hair for days afterward. Flesh had receded from the hands and faces of every man in the room, exposing the dark, desiccated tissue beneath. Eyes that should have been long collapsed were instead wide open, the pupils filmed white, oriented forward with a fixed, directional attention that was impossible in a dead organism. The man seated closest to Warnock at the field table had a wound channel visible through his left temple, an entry point consistent with a 7.62 round, the edges of which had long since dried and darkened, and he was moving his finger across the surface of the map in front of him in a slow, methodical tracing pattern, as if following a route, as if studying terrain, as if planning something. Warnock said later that what broke the paralysis was not courage and not training, but something much simpler and much more animal. The moment when the figure at the radio slowly turned its filmed white eyes toward him, without any change in the rest of its body, and the room temperature dropped so sharply and so instantly that all three Marines exhaled visible breaths simultaneously in air that 30 seconds earlier had been 31 degrees Celsius. Reinhold was the first one back through the canvas flap. Warnock was the last, and he did not run, but only, he would admit afterward, because his legs had temporarily stopped receiving instructions from the part of his brain responsible for issuing them. Warnock's after-action report, transmitted in fragments through Reinhold's partially restored radio at 2014 hours on November 14th, reached Lieutenant Douglas Farrell at the company's main position, approximately 1,200 meters east of the clearing, and Farrell's first response was the response of every competent officer confronted with a subordinate's account that his rational mind refuses to process. He assumed Warnock had misidentified the situation, that the darkness and stress of the approach had produced a collective perceptual error, and he assembled a full 12-man reinforcement element and moved toward the stronghold himself with the specific intention of demonstrating that there was a perfectly conventional military explanation for everything his most reliable sergeant had just described. Farrell was 31 years old, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, class of 1936, a man who had written his senior thesis on the psychological effects of prolonged combat stress on infantry unit cohesion, which made him, in the specific circumstances of what he was about to encounter, perhaps the least well-prepared officer in the entire Pacific Theater, because every analytical framework he possessed was about to become not merely useless, but actively counterproductive. Farrell's radio man, Corporal Winston Ibarra of Houston, Texas, had been attempting throughout the march to raise battalion headquarters on the Yasi ANPRC 6 field radio and had been met with consistent, total failure. Not the expected tropical interference pattern of intermittent static and broken transmissions, but the same absolute electronic silence that Reinhold had encountered. A silence that Ibarra described as feeling less like equipment malfunction and more like trying to shout into a room where the sound just stops existing before it gets anywhere. At the same time, 3 separate soldiers in Farrell's element independently reported that their wristwatches had stopped at different times during the approach. Farrell's own Hamilton Field watch, which he had worn through Guadalcanal without incident, had frozen at 1923 hours and could not be restarted regardless of the hand winding applied. It was Farrell's interpreter, a Filipino-American Army scout named Corporal Benicio Valdez, originally from Tacloban on Leyte's eastern coast, who first connected what they were encountering to something he recognized, and the recognition visibly drained, the color from a face that had remained professionally composed through 18 months of guerrilla operations against the Imperial Japanese Army. Valdez had grown up 40 kilometers from the western foothills. He knew the Visayan name for what that clearing was. He had been told as a child, in the specific and serious way, that Visayan parents communicated information they needed their children to never forget, that the place in the western hills where the dead did not leave was not a legend and not a metaphor. It was a geographic fact, as real and as permanent as the mountain range behind it, and that the only correct response to finding yourself near it was to leave immediately, without looking back, without speaking, and without stopping for any reason until you are far enough away that the air felt different. What Valdez then showed Farrell, retrieved from the interior pocket of his field jacket, was a folded document he had been carrying since the Tacloban briefings in October, a translated excerpt from a captured Japanese engineering survey dated March of 1944, which described the site selection process for the Western Foothills Communications Post. The survey noted, in the clipped, technical language of Imperial Army engineering reports, that local civilian laborers had refused categorically to work at the selected grid reference, that 7 of them had required physical coercion to approach the site, and that 3 had subsequently deserted rather than return. The survey's final notation, added in different handwriting that suggested a later amendment, read, Fuku no Chi, cursed ground, followed by a unit designation and the single word Heishi, meaning abandoned. The communications post had been recognized by its own builders as compromised before construction was even complete. Someone had finished building it anyway. And then, based on what Warnock's element had found inside, someone or something had kept it running long after every man assigned to it had died. Farrell made the decision that every piece of his training told him was correct, and every instinct he possessed told him was catastrophic. He ordered a second entry into the bunker at 2047 hours, this time with his full reinforcement element, with the stated objective of securing the Japanese maps and radio equipment as intelligence assets. The 11 figures were exactly where Warnock's element had left them. Exactly. Not approximately. Not roughly. With a positional precision that suggested they had not moved a single millimeter in the intervening hour and 46 minutes, which was itself deeply wrong, because living human beings maintaining standing positions shift their weight constantly and imperceptibly. And these figures were exhibiting a stillness that was not the stillness of discipline or training, but the stillness of objects. Private First Class Raymond Chu, the element's most junior member at 18 years old, was the first to register that the number was wrong. He counted twice, quietly, touching each figure with the barrel of his M1, garand rather than his hand, because something in him refused the idea of physical contact, and came up with 12. There had been 11 figures when Warnock's element made entry 90 minutes earlier. There were now 12. Scene 48. The new figure was standing at the eastern wall, between 2 of the original 11, in full Imperial Army uniform, in an advanced state of decomposition, consistent with the others, and its white, filmed eyes were oriented not forward like the rest, but directly toward the entrance, as if it had been placed there specifically to watch the door, as if whatever was operating, these bodies had known that the Marines would return and had made a preparation accordingly. Farrell ordered immediate withdrawal. He was halfway through issuing the order when every kerosene lantern in the bunker extinguished, simultaneously, not guttering out, not running dry, but going dark in the same instant, as if the oxygen in the room had been removed. And in the absolute darkness that followed, every man in the element heard, from multiple points around the interior of the structure, the slow, wet, deliberate sound of decomposing bodies beginning to move. The withdrawal from the bunker took 40 seconds and left 3 men behind, not because they were slow, not because they froze, but because in the absolute darkness, following the simultaneous extinction of every light source, the figures that had been standing at the eastern wall were no longer standing at the eastern wall, and Private Leon Szymanski, Corporal Winston Ibarra, and a rifleman named Private Edgar Holst of Columbus, Ohio, encountered them between themselves and the exit in a darkness so complete that the first indication any of the 3 had of what was in front of them was physical contact. What the men who made it outside heard from within the bunker during those 40 seconds was something that none of them would describe in detail in any subsequent account. Farrell's deposition refers to it only as sounds inconsistent with any form of human distress I had previously encountered in 3 years of Pacific combat, which, from a VMI graduate who had survived Peleliu, was a description that required no elaboration. Szymanski came through the entrance flap at the 40-second mark, moving fast and low, and the state he was in, uniform torn at the left shoulder, a handprint-shaped bruise already forming on his throat that the camp physician would later measure, at a grip width inconsistent with any hand size in the entire company roster, eyes showing full scleral exposure in a way that suggested his body had decided blinking was a luxury it could no longer afford, told every man outside exactly what the sounds had meant without a single word being exchanged. Ibarra followed 4 seconds later. Holst did not come out. Scene 54. What happened in the 70 minutes following the withdrawal from the bunker was the systematic destruction of every assumption about physical reality that the men of the 9th Rifle Company had carried with them from their previous combat experience, beginning with the moment at 2,131 hours, when the 11, now 12 figures emerged from the bunker entrance in a single-file formation and stood in the clearing in the rain with the rigid, upright bearing of a formal military inspection, facing the tree line where Fariel had positioned his men, as if they had known precisely where every one of them was. The rain, which had been falling steadily since before sundown, was not falling on them, not deflecting, not running off uniform fabric, simply stopping approximately 30 centimeters above each figure and dissipating, as if the air immediately surrounding each body existed at a different atmospheric pressure than the air around it, creating 12 discrete columns of dry space in a clearing that was otherwise thoroughly soaked. Farrell ordered his men to open fire at 2,133 hours, a decision that was tactically correct and physically pointless. Every man in the element was firing. Hokofer's bar, 6 M1 Garans, 2 Thompson submachine guns, Farrell's own .45 caliber sidearm, and the rounds were connecting, visibly, with impacts that should have been immediately and catastrophically incapacitating, and the figures absorbed every one of them without any change in posture, any reduction in forward movement, any indication whatsoever that the laws of ballistic physics applied to whatever they currently were. They were moving toward the tree line at a pace that was not running and not walking, but something between the two, a smooth, gliding forward progress that covered ground faster than its apparent speed suggested, closing the distance to Farrell's position with a mathematical consistency that gave every man watching it the specific, horrible understanding that this was not pursuit but approach, that these things were not chasing them but simply arriving, in the same way that a tide arrives, without urgency and without the possibility of being stopped. The tree line itself began changing at 2,141 hours, and this, more than the figures, more than the bunker, more than the sounds from inside, was what produced the first complete psychological collapses among Farrell's men, because the tree line was something they understood, something that had been a fixed and reliable feature of their physical environment, and watching it become something else removed the last reference point their minds had been using to anchor themselves to a reality they recognized. The trees at the clearing's edge were bending inward without wind, their canopy folding toward the center of the open ground in a slow, deliberate convergence that suggested not weather but intention, as if the vegetation itself was being directed, as if whatever was operating in this place had a relationship with the physical environment that extended beyond the bodies it was using and included the ground, the trees, the air, the rain that fell everywhere, except on the 12 figures still advancing across the clearing. Private First Class Samuel Okafor, who had carried his bar through Peleliu without a single documented moment of combat stress reaction, set the weapon down in the mud at 2,143 hours, sat down beside it, and began speaking in a calm, conversational tone to someone who was not there. His mother, Farrell believed, based on the fragments of the one-sided conversation that were audible over the rain, discussing in specific detail the layout of a kitchen in Baltimore that Okafor had not seen in 3 years. Corporal Reinhold was on his knees beside his dead radio equipment, methodically disassembling and reassembling the handset in the dark with the focused, repetitive concentration of a man whose mind had decided that if it could just solve this one solvable problem, everything else would become manageable again. Private Szymanski had not spoken since coming through the bunker entrance and showed no indication that he was processing external stimuli. His eyes were tracking the advancing figures with the fixed, empty attention of a man whose conscious mind had stepped away from the Yampi controls and left something much more primitive in charge. Valdez was praying in Visayan, quietly and continuously, with the specific focused urgency of a man who believed with complete sincerity that this was the only constructive action available to him, and was devoting his full professional attention to it. Farrell had 4 functional men left: himself, Warnock, Ibarra, and a rifleman named Private Curtis Fenimore of Savannah, Georgia, when the figures reached the tree line at 2,148 hours and stopped. Not slowed, not paused. Stopped, instantaneously, simultaneously, all 12 of them, at the exact boundary where the clearing met the first line of trees, with a precision of coordination that no living military unit could have achieved, and that demonstrated, more clearly than anything else that had happened in the preceding 3 hours, that what was operating these bodies was a single intelligence directing multiple physical instruments, rather than 12 individual organisms making 12 individual decisions. They stood at the tree line boundary in their single file formation, and they did not advance further, and they did not retreat, and they did not move at all. And the specific quality of attention they directed toward the 4 men still standing in the mud of the Philippine jungle at 2,148 hours on November 14, 1944, was the attention of something that was not threatening, and was not merciful, and was not angry. It was the attention of something that was simply, completely, and permanently aware of them, in the way that a place is aware of what happens within it, in the way that ground that has absorbed 10 centuries of the dead looks at the living who walk across it, and recognizes, with a patience that makes human time feel like nothing at all, that the living are only ever temporary visitors. What broke the stalemate at 2,217 hours was not a military decision and not a tactical maneuver, and not anything that Farrell or Warnock or any surviving member of the 9th Rifle Company's forward element had any part in engineering. It was an airstrike. 3 F-4U Corsairs of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 114, operating out of Tacloban Airfield on a night interdiction mission against Japanese supply lines in the western foothills, had been vectored onto the grid reference by a battalion fire support coordinator who had grown concerned about the extended radio silence from Farrell's element and had requested aerial reconnaissance as a precautionary measure, a routine protocol decision made by a man sitting at a field desk 12 kilometers away who would never know for the rest of his long and otherwise unremarkable military career what that routine decision had interrupted. The first 500-pound bomb impacted 40 meters north of the bunker at 2,217 hours and 12 seconds, and the effect on the 12 figures at the tree line boundary was immediate and total and utterly inconsistent with the effect of explosive ordnance on anything that the laws of physics governed. They did not scatter, did not fall, did not absorb the blast the way they had absorbed the rifle fire. They came apart, not violently, not dramatically. They simply lost cohesion, each figure dissolving from its edges inward over approximately 4 seconds, the uniform shapes becoming indistinct and then translucent and then absent, leaving 12 spaces of disturbed air that held their approximate outlines for another 2 or 3 seconds before the rain and the concussive pressure of the second bomb impact erased even those. The jungle noise returned at 2,218 hours. Insects, canopy movement, distant water, snapping back to full volume with the abruptness of a door opening, and every man still conscious in Farrell's element registered the return of that sound as the most profound relief any of them had ever experienced, because it meant the place had stopped paying attention to them, at least for now. The physical state of the survivors when the airstrike assessment team reached their position at 0034 hours on November 15th was documented in a medical report that was classified within 6 hours of its completion and has never been officially declassified, but fragments of it were described by the battalion surgeon, Major Gerald Pitts of the Army Medical Corps, in a private letter to his brother in Portland that surfaced in an estate sale in 1987. And was subsequently acquired by a private researcher before the relevant parties could intervene. Pitts described Farrell as ambulatory and verbally responsive, but exhibiting a specific pattern of dissociative behavior, answering questions accurately and coherently while simultaneously showing no emotional registration of his own answers, as if the part of him that processed language and the part of him that processed experience had been separated and were no longer communicating with each other. Warnock was physically uninjured and refused medical evaluation entirely, standing at the edge of the assessment team's perimeter with his M1 Garand at the low ready position, oriented toward the clearing for the entire duration of the team's presence at the site, not speaking, not responding to direct address, simply watching the tree line with the focused, unwavering attention of a man who had concluded that looking away was not something he was willing to risk. Szymanski was non-responsive to verbal stimuli and had to be physically guided to the evacuation point, moving compliantly but without apparent volition, his eyes maintaining the same fixed, empty orientation they had held since the bunker. Ibarra was found approximately 30 meters from the main group, sitting against a tree trunk, his radio equipment disassembled and arranged in a precise geometric pattern in the mud in front of him. Every component present, every piece accounted for, arranged with a care and symmetry that suggested hours of focused work rather than the 26 minutes that had actually elapsed since the airstrike. Of Private Edgar Holst of Columbus, Ohio, who had not come through the bunker entrance flap at the 40-second mark, the assessment team found nothing. Not remains, not equipment, not any physical evidence that he had ever been inside the structure. The bunker itself, partially collapsed by near-miss blast damage from the airstrike, contained 11 Japanese bodies in advanced decomposition, all in the positions and conditions consistent with men who had been dead for approximately 3 weeks, motionless, settled, showing none of the postural characteristics that Warnock's and Farrell's elements had observed. Whatever had been operating, they medicated the premises as thoroughly as if it had never been present at all. The officer who arrived at 0051 hours and took command of the site was not from Farrell's battalion and was not from any unit whose designation appeared on the Leyte order of battle. A lieutenant colonel who identified himself only by surname as Greer, accompanied by 4 enlisted men in unmarked utilities, who spoke to no one and photographed everything, moving through the blast-damaged clearing and the partially collapsed bunker with the efficient, unsurprised manner of people who had seen something like this before and had a procedure for it. Greer informed Farrell, in a brief, quiet conversation, that the incident would be classified under a category that Farrell had never heard, referenced in any briefing, training, or operational document. He used the phrase residual territorial phenomenon, delivered with the flat bureaucratic affect of a man reading from an internal manual, and told Farrell that his men would be transported to a rear area medical facility for evaluation, and that their statements regarding the events of November 14th would be taken individually in private by personnel from Greer's unit before any contact with battalion command was permitted. As Farrell's survivors were loaded onto the transport at 0118 hours, moving away from the western foothills, clearing toward the coast, Warnock, who had not spoken since the airstrike and had not lowered his rifle since the figures at the tree line dissolved, turned once in the back of the moving vehicle and looked toward the hills they were leaving behind. He said afterward, in the single deposition he was permitted before his transfer orders arrived, that the clearing was dark and empty, and that the bunker was a collapsed ruin, and that there was nothing there at all. And then he said that he looked for approximately 3 seconds before turning away, because in the middle of the empty clearing, standing at the exact boundary point where the 12 figures had stopped, there was a stillness that was shaped differently from the stillness around it. A density in the darkness that was not a figure and not a shadow and not anything he could name, but that was aware of the truck moving away and was watching it go with the patient. Permanent attention of something that had been in that ground for 1,000 years and understood, with a certainty that made human concepts of time feel like child's arithmetic, that it would still be there long after every man on that truck had turned to dust. The official record of the 9th Rifle Company, 1st Battalion, as it exists in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, shows a unit that participated in standard perimeter security operations in the Leyte interior during November of 1944, sustained 2 casualties from enemy small arms fire on November 12th, 2 days before the Western Foothills incident, and was rotated to rear area duties on November 16th due to cumulative combat fatigue. There is no entry for November 14th. Not a redacted entry, not a classified reference, not a placeholder notation indicating that records exist but are restricted. Simply no entry, as if the date had been excised from the unit's operational timeline with the clean, deliberate precision of a surgeon removing tissue that cannot be allowed to remain. The morning report for November 15th lists full company strength with no personnel changes from November 13th, which means that Private Edgar Holst of Columbus, Ohio, who did not come through a canvas flap in a Philippine jungle at the 42nd mark, is listed in the official record as having been present for duty on the morning after the night he disappeared, and remains listed as having been honorably discharged in March of 1945, a discharge that his family received documentation for that generated a separation payment that was cashed. And that corresponds to a human being who, based on every piece of physical evidence available, ceased to exist inside a decomposing Japanese bunker on a cursed hillside in Leyte at some point between 2047 and 2,131 hours on November 14, 1944. Lieutenant Douglas Farrell was transferred to an administrative posting in Hawaii within 3 weeks of the incident, a reassignment framed in his service record as a routine rotation that his commanding officer had apparently requested on his behalf without Farrell's knowledge or input. He completed his service without further combat deployment, resigned his commission in 1947, returned to Virginia, and taught secondary school history in Roanoke for 31 years. His former students, interviewed decades later for a regional newspaper retrospective on his retirement, described him as a gifted and dedicated educator who never once, in 3 decades of teaching, discussed his own military service, not on Veterans Day, not when students asked directly, not under any circumstance. His wife of 40 years told the same interviewer that he had never slept through a full night in the entirety of their marriage, and that on the rare occasions when she had asked him about the Pacific, he had responded with a patience and a gentleness that she recognized over time as the specific kindness of a man who had decided to protect the people he loved from something he carried alone. Sergeant Theodore Warnock was transferred to a supply depot in New Guinea 48 hours after the incident, the fastest reassignment his service record shows any justification for, and was discharged in late 1945 with a commendation for his service at Guadalcanal and Peleliu that made no reference to the Philippines whatsoever. He returned to Youngstown, worked in the steel industry for 20 years, and died in 1978 of a cardiac event at the age of 60. His daughter, Patricia Warnock Heller, told a researcher in 2003 that her father had kept a small notebook throughout his adult life that he never allowed anyone to read, and that when she found it after his death, it contained, cover to cover, a single phrase repeated in her father's handwriting hundreds of times. Not a sentence, not an explanation, just a location. Western Hills, Leyte, November 14th, as if the act of writing it down, over and over across 3 decades, was the only way he had found to keep it at a distance that made the rest of his life possible. Corporal Augusto Reinhold was hospitalized at a rear area facility in Leyte for 11 days following the incident, diagnosed with acute combat stress reaction, and returned to limited duty in December of 1944. His service record from that point forward shows a pattern of minor disciplinary infractions, insubordination, unauthorized absences, 1 incident of destroying government property that involved a field radio, that reads less like a soldier deteriorating and more like a man systematically making himself too difficult to deploy forward again. He was discharged in 1946 and spent the remainder of his working life as an electrician in Milwaukee, dying in 1991. His son told a Veterans Oral History Project in 1994 that his father had refused to own a radio of any kind for the last 40 years of his life and became visibly agitated in the presence of shortwave. Equipment specifically, not AM, not television, not any other broadcast medium, only shortwave, and had never provided any explanation for this that his family found satisfying. Private Leon Szymanski was not discharged. He was transferred directly from the Rear Area Medical Facility to a Veterans Administration Psychiatric Hospital in California in January of 1945 under a diagnosis of severe dissociative disorder with catatonic features that his intake documentation describes as having been present since an unspecified combat incident in the Philippine theater. He remained institutionalized for the rest of his life, dying in the facility in 1983 at the age of 58. Facility records, obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed in 1999 and partially fulfilled in 2004, indicate that Szymanski was cooperative, nonviolent, and entirely functional in terms of basic daily activities throughout his institutionalization. He ate, he slept, he participated in occupational therapy, he responded to direct address. He simply never spoke again, not once, not a single documented word in 38 years. And the nursing staff notes from his final decade describe, with a matter-of-factness that somehow makes it more disturbing rather than less, that he spent a significant portion of each day seated at the window of his room that faced west, watching the horizon with the fixed, patient attention of a man who was waiting for something that he had every reason to believe would eventually arrive. The site at grid reference XT7741 in the western foothills of Leyte was subjected to a follow-up airstrike on November 17, 1944, described in Tacloban Airfield's operational log as a denial strike on confirmed enemy fortification. Standard language that generated no additional documentation and attracted no additional attention. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken 3 days after the strike show a clearing with no standing structures and significant blast scarring across the surrounding tree line. They also show, in the northeastern quadrant of the clearing, a formation of disturbed earth that the photo interpreter's notes describe as possible enemy excavation, origin unclear, a roughly circular depression, approximately 8 meters in diameter, that was not present in earlier reconnaissance photographs of the same grid reference, and that the follow-up ground assessment team, dispatched on November 23rd and consisting entirely of personnel from Lieutenant Colonel Greer's undesignated unit, spent 4 hours examining before departing without filing any report that has ever been located in any archive. Filipino historians and anthropologists working in the western Leyte interior in the 1970s and 1980s documented extensive oral tradition among Visayan communities in the region, describing the location at XT7741, known locally as Ang Lugar simply, the place, as if no further identification was necessary, as a site that had been avoided by every human settlement in the surrounding area for as long as communal memory extended. Their fieldwork notes, compiled by Dr. Remedios Aguilar of the University of the Philippines Visayas in a 1983 monograph that received limited academic circulation, describe interviews with elderly residents who stated without elaboration that the site was not dangerous in the way that a physical hazard was dangerous. It was not something that would harm you if you stumbled into it accidentally. It was something that would keep you. That the distinction in the understanding of the communities who had lived alongside it for generations was important. That there was a difference between a place that killed and a place that collected. And that Ang Lugar had always been, in the oldest and most precise sense of the Visayan term the elders used, Ising Lugar na nagtitipon ng mga hindi pa tipos, a place that gathered the unfinished. Private Edgar Holst of Columbus, Ohio, son of Walter and Irene Holst, graduate of East High School, class of 1944, enlisted June 12, 1944, deployed to the Pacific Theater, September 3, 1944, listed as honorably discharged March 1945, survived by his parents, and one younger sister, Eleanor, who kept his discharge papers in a cedar box on her mantelpiece until her own death in 2001. and who told anyone who asked that her brother had come home from the war fine. Just fine. He just didn't want to talk about it, which was true of so many of them, wasn't it? And you had to respect that. You had to give them their silence because they had earned it. Ang lugar inji may namate na hindi umalis. The place where the dead did not leave. It is still there. The coordinates have not changed. The ground has not forgotten. And somewhere in the western hills of Leyte, in a clearing that the jungle has long since reclaimed, in soil that has been absorbing the unfinished for longer than written history can reach, something that the Visayan elders never named directly is still doing what it has always done. Still collecting, still waiting, still turning its patient and permanent attention toward anyone who comes close enough to be noticed, with the absolute certainty of a thing that has never once, in 1,000 years of trying, failed to keep what it decided to keep. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.